I think the meditation and the Buddhist practice is telling us to say, okay, well, given that that is so much of your kind of orientation, the natural orientation towards judgment and moving towards and moving against craving, aversion, or getting bored, right? Delusion, this idea that this isn't exciting enough for me.
What does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit in that? We tackle those questions and others in the School of Financial Freedom podcast. We talk about the role of money in our personal growth and spiritual liberation, the concrete math of budgeting and saving and investing, and how all this relates to the life you were meant to lead. Each episode is an interview with a former student of my online course, Financial Freedom 1, where they explain their favorite lesson and years later, what financial, behavioral, and spiritual impact it had on them. I'm Douglas Soy, founder of School of Financial Freedom, and your host. Glad you're here.
Hello, this is Danielle LaSusa, and this is the School of Financial Freedom podcast.
I'm excited to have Danielle LaSusa here today, doing one of my favorite lessons, lesson 2.6, which is the concept of lagom and what is enough, because Danielle's actually one of my favorite people. She's one of my closest friends, and we talk about these things all the time. And Danielle will introduce herself, but you're going to find out very, very soon. She can talk very articulately with a lot of depth on this topic. So Danielle, introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Douglas. My name is Danielle, and I am, I call myself a philosophical coach, which is a title that I just sort of made up for myself. It means that I'm a philosopher for hire. I have a PhD in philosophy, and I use that training to help support people to think well and choose wisely and live with intention. And I specialize in helping new and expectant moms grapple with what it means to make a human being. I work with clients one-on-one. I teach a course called The Meaning of Motherhood, and I'm writing a book about my own motherhood journey.
Well, I mean, philosopher for hire, that sounds more dangerous than assassin for hire. Even before we start, I'm just because I love the idea, I'm just super curious for you to explain, there's a philosophy of motherhood?
Well, I mean, it's not well articulated, honestly. You know, philosophy has historically been rich old white men, and not many of them talked about procreation, parenting in any regard, and particularly not motherhood. So it's a really new area of philosophy, and not a lot of people have written about it. But my own experience in becoming a mother, it sort of shocked me into realizing how much philosophical richness there is in, having a new human life grow inside of you and then come out into the world. It's like a new consciousness. It's the beginning of, the human condition. And I find it actually kind of appalling that philosophers have not taken it seriously. So that's part of my work, is to think and write and talk about it.
And to be clear, you have a PhD in philosophy. You were a professor.
Yes.
Yes. It's interesting because philosophy is supposed to be about the human condition, and if you can't talk about the basic element of childbirth, I feel like we're missing something very elemental in the human condition.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's a real detriment to philosophy as a discipline to ignore this. I think it actually is a problem for the discipline itself, because it's ignoring part of the human experience and the whole body of knowledge and wisdom that comes from that. I think it's just, it's like the ultimate example of patriarchy and sexism that's left out of the discipline.
So you're telling me in like 3,000 years of philosophy, they've never talked about motherhood? Does that mean like 2,000 or 3,000 years from now, they're going to be talking about you in the same way they're talking about Socrates?
Oh, I'm sure of it. Yeah, I'm going to be one of the greats that, are in legends and hallways.
Great. Well, then I'm super glad to have you on this episode. This is one they're going to remember.
Of course.
Years from now. So you chose. Well, first of all, when did you take financial freedom?
Well, we did some sleuthing to figure out what it was. I think I took it in 2019. It looks like it was, that spring or summer. So I guess about 5 years ago now.
5 years.
Yeah.
And it still had an effect on you.
Yeah. Well, I'm friends with you and you can't stop talking about it. So.
Well, you chose literally 2.6, which is literally the core of the course, which is lagom and the concept of what is enough. So can you just go through the lesson and talk it through, like to someone who's never heard or been in the course before?
Sure. Yeah. So the word lagom, and correct me if I'm wrong on any part of this, please, but my understanding, it's a Swedish word that means just the right amount, not too much, not too little. And it is sort of the thing that you are aiming for, so a synonym might be something like enough, but to me, it has a little bit more pull than that, because it's something that you are trying to achieve is the lagom. So lagom then is something that can guide, in the lesson, it's talking about how lagom is something that can guide our financial choices, and also kind of the way our consumption choices. And in the lesson, you talk about how there has been a kind of increase of desire for a bigger house, more stuff, and that over the decades, the size of your average home has gotten bigger, disposable income amounts have gotten bigger, and the amount of stuff that we buy and acquire and accumulate has just become more and more and more. And, of course, the challenge that you make to us is any of this making us happier? Or are we just kind of, we simply don't have a good sense of what enough is. We don't know what lagom is, and we're failing to orient our decisions toward that idea. And that perhaps the task for each of us is to really think about what enough means to us and to kind of push back against this cultural trend toward always more and greater and growth and, bigger is better. Did I get it right?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because lagom, is literally translated as enough, but the connotation of it is a feeling of deep satisfaction. And, in the lesson, we talk about there are studies where Americans, there are two things that Americans feel across all income levels. No matter what income level you have, everyone is slightly dissatisfied, right? Like on a satisfaction life scale of one to five, everyone in every income level is under 3, slightly under 3. Everyone's just slightly dissatisfied. And then the other one is, when you ask people what would be enough money, everyone says about $10,000 more than they have.
Right. Just a little bit more.
Just a little bit more. And it's funny because I think about this, and you probably too, like what was enough for me when I was in my 20s is no longer enough for me now that I'm in my 50s.
Yeah, definitely. And there's something, when you're in your 20s and you are kind of living in crappy little apartments as I did, and, going to get the very cheapest deals at the very cheapest places to eat out, you think like, there's a lot of freedom that I felt in my 20s, and it was great. And I'm like, oh, I'm never going to let my lifestyle creep happen. I'm just going to, this is great. This is all I need. And anytime I earn more money, I'll just use it to buy my freedom and buy my time. And of course, lifestyle creep happens to many of us, perhaps most of us.
How do you process that?
I don't know. I mean, I do think that like when I was in my 20s, there was a part of me that was like, oh, I'm going to be smart and I'm not going to like let myself be duped or kind of like won over by the American consumer culture. But at the same time, there was also inside of me the desire for, a nice home and a nice neighborhood. And kind of when I imagined midlife, I imagined kind of what I have now. which is a much bigger house and with a much bigger mortgage and a lot of the kind of trappings of middle class American consumer culture. So both of those, I think, desires were inside of me at the same time. And to be honest, they both still are.
Yeah, you chose this lesson. And when you chose this lesson, you told me, I think about this issue all the time.
I do. Yeah. Yeah, it is like I am in a particular moment right now where I'm spending a lot of time thinking about my relationship with money. And I feel like there is always this tension I'm experiencing. On the one hand, I have this big, beautiful home that I absolutely love. And there are goals that I have for myself and things that I want to put in a skylight and I want to build a porch and or deck in the back and I want to repaint it and I want to do all these things to beautify it and make it more of the vision I have in my head. And at the same time, I think like, but if I didn't, I think back to my younger days when I was like obsessed with like tiny homes and thought like, oh, I will just, have no mortgage and be able to go and, live freely and do what I want. And yeah, I feel a very kind of push-pull relationship with with money and with consumption. And I I feel kind of stuck in it, to be honest.
How much of this is related to the fact that you became a mother?
Well, I don't know. I mean, certainly it's much harder, I think. I haven't done it, but I imagine it's much harder to live in a small, crappy apartment or live in a tiny home or a trailer or whatever when you have a child or children, like they just take up more space. And I also had like a vision for the kind of place that I wanted my kid to grow up in. And, she's got her own room and she gets to decorate it how she wants. And, I think so many of us actually just try and like consciously or not, we end up replicating our own childhoods. And I think that even though we make certain changes, like there's this baseline, or at least for me, there was this baseline of like what I thought a good, say, like stable home for my child would look like. And that required more than just like a tiny home or a trailer.
I have another student who is going to be talking about the story of stuff lesson and environmentalism, and he's an environmentalist. But as soon as he became a father and had an infant, he realized like capitalism is going to bite you back once you have a child.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts about parenthood and capitalism?
Oh my God. I mean, the mother industrial complex is like just, yeah, there are lots of ways I could take that. But like, even if you think about literally, I mean, the environmental question, like you have a baby and they have diapers, like just managing diapers is its own kind of like nightmare where you're like either are, it costs a lot of money. Like having a baby is really expensive. And it costs them a lot of money, not only to like feed and clothe and, like pay for the stuff, but also to care for them. And yeah, there's lots of like gender and power and politics that I could get into. But I think it's like it's such a shame because I find myself wanting to envision and imagine a world in which, we live in community. We have the village that everybody talks about. We share resources. We live in these communal homes. But our society just isn't set up that way. And we all find ourselves in these single family homes with the mortgages, with we all got to buy our own diapers and our own washing machines and our own things to like manage our lives. And it makes everything that kind of like American individualism, it just makes everything harder. And so for me, when I had a child, I saw capitalism and patriarchy and the intersection of them. I was like, oh, having a baby is like ground zero for capitalist patriarchy. Like you feel it in this moment. At least for me, I felt it in that moment more than I ever had in my whole life.
Go one level deeper. Say more.
Well, I feel like we're getting off track from lagom, but I can keep going if you want. Yeah. So, for example, like having a baby, like you have to have time to care for it. And, my husband and I, when we decided that we were going to do this, like I didn't have a job at the time, and we had moved to Portland recently, and I wasn't looking for a job because I thought that I would probably be, I'd be spending time taking care of the baby. And my husband had like 2 weeks of unpaid family leave to be home with me, and then went back to work. And that kind of, I talked to women who were bartenders and were back waiting tables and tending bar like literally 3 days after having a baby, which in my mind is just like unconscionable. Like it's criminal what we do to people. Like if you've ever had a baby, you know the bodily trauma that it is. And this just like psychological intensity of it, and expecting people to like jump back into the capitalist machine right away to support themselves, and or to depend on partners to care for them, when really like we should have structures in place to care for all of us. Like if we want to raise children that are like, you know, feel loved and cared for and well adjusted and aren't going to end up like shooting up their school, then we need to like do the work of caring for them as a society. But we don't. We leave people to be on their own. We drop them off in these single family homes where people are separated from each other, isolated, sleep deprived, and told that if they're not happy about it, they're doing it wrong. And I think the whole thing is just like, it makes me very angry.
It's interesting. I've been following Ezra Klein, and he's had a series of guests on his podcast talking about, we imagine that in order to change things, we need to change political or economic structures. The things that we don't actually really want to touch are the structures of our most intimate relationships, like the single family home, right? Like, and some of his guests are talking about, and to restructure this idea that a family is a unit of two parents and children, nothing else is going to change.
Yeah, no, I think that's really right. And actually, the idea of the family as being that is an invention. It's an invention of capitalism and patriarchy, and it's a way, honestly, I think, to isolate women from one another and to kind of strip them of their power.
Well, that brings us actually back into the lesson, because in the lesson we talk about, in the book Sapiens, the author talks about this idea that we live in modern times in a place where we can produce anything we want, and we have to figure out ways for people to actually buy them. Like, we can produce as much as we want of anything. The issue is not a supply, but a demand. We have unlimited supply and we have limited demand. So the question is, how do we get people to want more and more things? And I think the single family home is actually one of the ways that capitalism does that.
Oh, totally. Well, yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about, like if everyone needs their own lawnmower because they have to take care of their own lawn, then you sell more lawnmowers. But if we live in a communal system and there's one lawnmower for these, 10 households, well, then there are just fewer lawnmowers that are going to be sold.
But Danielle, both you and I live in homes where we have washer dryers, and we don't want to go to the laundromat.
Yeah, right. That's true. Right. Yes. And I think part of it is about class and status, right? Like the idea of sharing with your community, it sort of depends on where on the class structure you fall as to how interpret or perceive that kind of communal sharing.
You just blew my mind there. I mean, what you're saying is to have to share and to be in community or dependent on other people is actually a lower class thing in capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when you think about it, maybe that's right. Right? That like part of having status is having your own of everything.
And not being dependent on others.
Yeah.
Right? Like on the
right. You can buy your way to individualism.
Yeah, on the very far edges of it is like to be able to have a home that is off the grid, solar panels on its own well, so you don't have to depend on society.
Well, yeah. And, when the apocalypse comes, you go into your private bunker and not have to depend on anybody else, which just means that, you probably you're not super interested in funding communal programs or systems for other people when there is a value structure that says that those who are wealthy, i.e., in a puritanical capitalist system, better people have more money, can do everything themselves, are self-reliant and independent, then the idea of making use of communal structures is a kind of moral failing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, the liberal progressive group that we live in, right? The status group we live in would all agree to that. And at the same time, we all want to send our kids to quote good schools,
Mm-hmm.
right? We don't.
Yeah. Well, right. I'm not using the laundromat. I'm using my washer and dryer because it's easier, more convenient, and because like there's some thought I may have about like what kind of people use the laundromat.
Um, so going back to this idea of like you have the life you have imagined. Do you feel like you have enough now? Do you feel a deep satisfaction, a lagom in your life?
Well, to answer that question, I feel like I need to kind of like have two different scope perspective. I think in the big picture, yeah, I've got a lot of what I want. Like I have a beautiful home in a beautiful neighborhood. I get to spend my day doing work that I really care about and helping people. A lot of my daily activities really align with my values, and I have a beautiful family. Lots of things are going well for me. So in the big picture, yes. In this particular moment, I think my family is having a financially difficult moment. My husband's about to be laid off, and my business is. I've been kind of deprioritizing it because I've been working on finishing a draft of a book that I'm working on, and I've just run out of money. So now I have to go back and start finding more clients um, and kind of working on the business. And I'm not quite finished with the book, and so yeah, it's and the bills are much bigger than they used to be because we have the bigger house with the bigger mortgage. And thinking about back to my 20s when everything seemed like, oh, I could just live like this cheap and easy forever. Like, I was talking to a friend yesterday who was like, well, you could always like get a job, doing whatever at a coffee shop. And I'm like, no, I at this point, like that's a drop in the bucket. That's not going to cut it for the kind of bills that I got, that I have to pay right now. So, yeah, at the moment it feels difficult, and I do not currently feel like we have enough coming in to feel deeply satisfied. My hope is that that will feel different in a few months, and I trust that that will be true. But even then, even when everything is going right, there's still this desire for like more and bigger and better, more beautiful, bigger, fuller expression.
Well, two interesting things here. Like when you first described it as like you described, you had a beautiful house and in a great neighborhood, and you said things are going well, but things are going well as an external description, right? There's not an internal sense of things going well. Um, and it sort of brings up the hedonic treadmill, right? Like the hedonic treadmill is that like as things get better, we just become acclimated to the betterness, and then we think it's normal.
Yeah, that has absolutely been true. When we first moved into this house, I was like, I can't believe we live here. This is so amazing. This neighborhood is so beautiful. Oh my God, I'm going to be grateful for this every day. And that lasted, a couple months. And then now it's just like, our house needs painting and this, we don't have enough money for this. Wow. It's easy to, like you said, get acclimated and wanting it to be better than it was. Yeah, it's really challenging. It's really challenging. And I think that, you talked about that deep sense, like the internal feeling versus the external experience of it. And this kind of gets to the heart of the question about lagom, right? Like what does it take to really feel deeply satisfied within yourself? And Philosophically, I kind of struggle with this because I do think that, like the kind of Buddhist perspective is that like we just need to desire less and be happier with what we have and kind of like take things as they are. But at the same time, like I think a lot about what Aristotle said about striving as being part of the good life. He talks about the Greek concept of arete as which means kind of like excellence or the pursuit of excellence. And I think, you know, he means that in the sense of like if you're learning to play the guitar, like you don't just want to play it, you want to be excellent at it. And like the pursuit of that excellence is part of the good life. It's part of what we experience when we experience joy and flourishing. And so I don't know. I find myself kind of like tugged between these two ideas of like really believing that wanting to get better and to kind of have the fullest expression of myself and my life and my desires is a good thing. But on the other hand, I know that it can be the source of a lot of suffering. And your ideas about what could or should be as they compared to what is, you feel the gap and then you feel dissatisfied. So I don't know. I find myself kind of caught.
Well, it seems, this idea of arete, is about excellence, right? Like it's a personal virtue. Like playing the guitar better is this desire that feels different to me than, well, the fullest expression of ourselves is mediated through capitalism by having nicer things, right? Like, who's the guy who wrote The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe?
Oh, C.S. Lewis?
C.S. Lewis would talk about like, we have disordered desire, right? Like we think that like playing the mud in the back of our house is great when there's a huge ocean that is available to us.
Mm.
I'm just curious, like, are certain desires better than others?
Mm. Yeah, it's a good question, right? And I think it gets to maybe one of the other lessons where we talk about like what is our deepest longing? And it's probably not for a skylight in in my attic, converted attic. But I do think that pleasure, like, and warmth and, the sun in my face certainly is one of my deepest desires. And so, yeah, I don't know. Yes, I absolutely agree with what you said that like mediated through capitalism, it's like, here's the stuff, right? Like there's this idea that the fullest expression of your life has to look like it does on Pinterest. And that is obviously untrue, right? These are arbitrary created things. But I do think that human beings desire beauty and desire pleasure and desire delight and freedom and all of these other things that money can give us access to. It just can.
Yeah, two thoughts. Aristotle would ask, what is the good life? And I'm curious, like, it seems like in capitalism, our sense of what the good life is having a bunch of things and like going on a bunch of vacations. And that seems very different than what Aristotle would say what the good life is. I recognize in myself, a certain stoic / ascetic / Buddhist aestheticism, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I was actually reading a really interesting interview with the author of Come As You Are.
Oh yeah, Emily Nagoski.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she talked about being able to distinguish the difference between desire and pleasure. Desire is wanting something you don't have, and pleasure is actually existing and what is at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so mm-hmm. I thought it was a super interesting difference between desire and pleasure, like, and pleasure in Hinduism, kama, is like actually one of the principal spiritual pursuits.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I recognize there's a certain anti-desire aspect that can be a form of like spiritual bypass in at least the Western interpretations of Buddhism.
Yeah, certainly I think that there are ways to access those things that I articulate: pleasure, beauty, delight, connection, whatever. Like, we don't have to get those things through the stuff we buy, like the expensive meals or the vacations or whatever. We can access those things in lots of different situations. And I think maybe the lesson is to become aware of and really lean into the places where you can access those things in your life as it currently exists. That said, I do think that, like, when I think about what capitalism, or what I want it with the money that I have, it's not necessarily like go on fancy vacations, because I think that then I'll be happy. Like, I have cried on a Miami beach before, right? Like, I I understand that, like, just because you go somewhere that you think is going to be wonderful doesn't, you still have to bring yourself there, right? Like, and all of your own neuroses and all of your displeasures and all of your dissatisfaction comes with you. Um, so I'm not under the illusion that, like, that is going to give us all the things that we need. We have to have an orientation towards finding those things, wherever they may be. And at the same time, like, I have also, like, recently went out to a meal with a friend that was a pretty expensive meal, and it was, like, exquisite. And the quality of the food is not something that I experience in other parts of my life. Like, getting access to that kind of experience takes money. Just, like, and there's obviously there are ways to experience that don't, but given the certain capitalist culture that we live in, like, this is just how it is. And I wish that it wasn't. I wish that we could all experience all of the beauty of the world without having to mediate those experiences with currency and with and within the capitalist system. But that's the one that we live in. And so because of that, like, I want delight. I want to have delicious meals, and I want you know, um, to have beauty in my home and all of those things. And I don't know. I don't know how to parse these things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about, like, how one of the things that money buys you is class status, and more importantly, or just as importantly, discernment, right? Like, I have
Yeah.
a lot of immigrant family members who would not be able to enjoy that expensive meal in the way that you enjoyed that expensive meal, right? And so taste is one of the markers of class, and our ability to metaphorically and literally have taste in um, is one of the markers of class. I'm curious, you're a pretty serious meditator. I think you're on day 300 of straight meditation. Tell me, like, your mindfulness and Buddhist practice, and what does it tell you about this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that what is what meditating a lot tells me is that so much of our experiences are mediated by through the stories we tell about them, what they mean, um, and our judgments of them. And so, your comment about discernment, right? Like, oh, this is really good or this is not good. And I am a lot of things, but one of them is a snob when it comes to to aesthetic experiences. Like, I am often, with my own cooking, I really enjoy cooking, but I will taste it and be like, well, there's not enough lemon juice in it or whatever. Like, I am a pretty judgmental person when it comes to aesthetic experiences.
Which is so funny because this lesson is called "What Is Enough."
Right. Yeah. So right. So, like, discernment about that, I guess, is an important thing to have. But I do think that there is something to be said. Like, I think as human beings, we, and I in particular, we kind of default towards judgment about our experiences, right? And that's for good reason. Like, we have a negativity bias because it helped us survive, right? Like, don't eat those berries. They're really bad. They'll give you a bad experience. Stay away from them. And we remember that so that we don't die. um, and so we're constantly making judgments because it helps protect our survival. And so I think the, like, meditation and the Buddhist practice is telling us to say, okay, well, given that that is so much of your kind of orientation, the natural orientation towards judgment and moving towards and moving against craving, aversion, or getting bored, right? Delusion, this idea that this isn't exciting enough for me. That to be able to be open and curious to all of our experiences, whatever they may be, helps us live more deeply. And so that, it doesn't matter what meal you're eating, there's more to the experience of eating than judging it as good or bad. Like it may be that it's just a regular Taco Tuesday night at my house, and that can be its own kind of fulfilling experience, particularly if you lean into some of the other like Buddhist ideas of the fact that we are all interrelated and connected, right? Like the food that you're eating was grown in the ground and picked by people and nourished by the sun and drank in rain and water and made a long journey to get to where you are. And if you eat it with that in mind, it helps you feel more connected and more connected to the others who brought it to you and more connected to the earth. And there's something to be said about leaning into that experience rather than just, this needs more lime or more salt or whatever.
Talk about the connection between gratitude and lagom.
Yeah, I think gratitude is kind of where the whole thing resides, right? Like, so I choose a word of the year every year. And in 2022, my word of the year was gratitude. And I spent the first 6 months really bristling against that word. Like I chose it because I felt like I was being called to or needed to, but I realized that I actually didn't. The idea of gratitude, I felt like it was kind of patronizing. It had this kind of like, I don't know, finger wagging quality about it. Like you should be more grateful. It made me feel shame, actually. And so I really resisted this idea of like, oh, it's an attitude of gratitude. It felt very kind of like trite and reminded me of my like those Chicken Soup for the Soul books I used to read as a kid. So I really resisted it for months, but I actually started this project where I would text 3 things I'm grateful for to a group of friends, and we all started doing that. And after a month of it, like I felt like a different person. Like I realized that I started looking for the things in my life that were beautiful and delightful and pleasurable. And I noticed that my list was often of things that were very simple, like strawberries and the sun is out and, I got to take a hot bath or whatever it was, connections with my kid. And rarely was it like I got to experience this, very expensive thing, or this thing that is mediated, like you say, through capitalism. Although I don't know. Everything that we experience is mediated through capitalism. So those strawberries had to come from somewhere, and I had to have the money to be able to buy them. But all of that is to say, really noticing them and appreciating them just makes it feel like you have so much more. Once you can turn your attention to what you do have, there is a deeper satisfaction with what you do have. There's less of the feeling of it not being enough and of needing more to feel better. And you start to just appreciate what you have. I heard this quote recently and I forgot who said it, but it was something like, hoping your circumstances will improve, or waiting until your circumstances improve in order to feel better is like looking in the mirror and waiting for your reflection to smile first. And I think focusing on gratitude is a way of smiling first and then letting your reflection smile back at you.
Yeah, and there's a sense, and I don't know if it's only in America, but definitely in America, there's a sense for us of like, I'll be happy if, or I'll be happy when, right?
Yeah.
And it's not only about consumption. It's also about, our careers or, our relationships. I'll be happy, if I get, a raise, or I'll be happy if I publish our book, or I'll be happy if I get in a relationship, right? But I think that's probably a false god.
Yeah. Well, right. Because the thing is, I've had experiences like where I did the thing that I had wanted to do. I was like, if I could do this, then I would feel like I was okay. Or I'd made it, I would be good, I would be happy. And then the thing happened. And it was like, wait a minute, why don't I feel good? Right. And I think sometimes what can happen is when people actually achieve the thing they have been thinking will bring them happiness, and then it doesn't, then things go real sideways, right? That's when people can get really depressed because they realize that the answer is not there.
Well, I think that, in America, we have this expectation that we should be happy and we should
Mm-hmm.
be happy at all times. And, if happiness is a mood, that setting of heightened expectations is probably a large reason why we're so discontent, paradoxically.
Right. Like there's this idea that like you should be, because you have the expectation that you should be feeling a certain way and you're not, because that's just not how humans generally feel, then we have a judgment on our feelings and then further discontent.
I heard the Danes are, depending on how you ask the question, are some of the unhappiest and happiest people on Earth. And part of it is just they have lower expectations than the Americans.
Mm.
But their lowered expectations are consistently met.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the whole thing, right? About like just wanting less, like rein in your desires. I remember hearing this kind of like metaphor for that way of thinking, right? That you have a suitcase and you got all this stuff, and the stuff it won't fit in the suitcase. So you only have two options. You either got to get a bigger suitcase or you just need less stuff. That's it. Those are the only two. You can't like bend space and time. And so I think the kind of ascetic answer is like, well, have less stuff. And the capitalist answer is get a bigger suitcase.
And what's your answer?
I mean, I feel like that's the thing. I'm just staring at the suitcase going like, I don't know. It's not going to fit. I'm not really sure which of these to do. I think I've been doing that for years.
Well, going back to the Danes, the most famous Danish philosopher is Kierkegaard,
Mm-hmm.
who's written, and I actually literally do not know what he's written about, but he's written a lot about happiness, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, he's written about happiness, and I know Kierkegaard best for his writings about faith. But yeah, I mean, he's not particularly, I wouldn't call him like the happiness philosopher.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, people describe him as the unhappy philosopher.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, he has written about happiness and about like dread and anguish and a lot of the existential ideas of deep depression too, in ways that are just sort of like, look, it's just a part of life. Like, it's something that is part of the human condition. And I think that that's part of, like, I have a deep, maybe because of, I don't know, my being drawn to existential philosophy, and I don't know, maybe because I'm a Cancer or who knows why, but I tend to have a pretty high tolerance for melancholy and discontent. But it is I feel like I'm always wrestling with happiness, trying to convince myself that it is okay to feel discontent. And I think as Americans, part of our orientation towards happiness is a way of really not looking at, feeling into, and experiencing our other emotions. We tend to paper them over, and just, it's a way of abandoning ourselves and casting parts of ourselves out and saying that they're unacceptable. And anytime you say a part of yourself is unacceptable, you're not going to be deeply satisfied.
Yeah, I heard recently that any substance use, even if it's, quote, healthy substance use, is just a way of not wanting to feel what you're feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, TikTok is a substance as far as I'm concerned in my household.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, consumerism itself, and perhaps even workism, is a way of not wanting to feel what you're feeling. Like, I was talking to a friend who makes $450,000 a year, and easily leave their job and do fire. But he says, like, if I left my job, I've run out of excuses, right? Like right now, if I'm stressed out and if I'm upset, I can blame it on having employees that aren't, cooperating, or that, I have, some clients that are just being really difficult. But if I lose all that, I actually come up with the idea that those feelings are actually internal to me.
Yeah, man. I mean, certainly like when you externalize your happiness and say that it is dependent upon a goal, and then all of your activity and all of your thinking gets oriented toward that, it is certainly a way of just avoiding looking at your own shit.
Well, it's interesting because you talk about sort of like this tendency to melancholy, which I think Kierkegaard would would fall under. Um, it seems like maybe are we asking the same wrong question? We keep on asking ourselves in all our behaviors, what can I do to be happy? When, as a philosopher, the question is what is the good life?
Yeah.
And the good life is not necessarily being happy. What is the good life if it's not being happy?
Well, right. I mean, there are lots of ways to answer that question. I mean, I think some people, that there are lots of different people who have said that there are certain things that people report a greater quality of life, and that those things include like meaningful work in the world, strong connections with others, a deep sense of one's own internal worthiness and okayness, connection to nature, um, and the ability to sort of experience and let in love and pleasure, and none of those are happiness per se. I think that connecting to others deeply is sometimes not happy. Like we might be in a really vulnerable or painful situation with other people, and intimacy is not always a happy experience, but it can be a deeply meaningful one. Doing work that we care about in the world may not always be a happy experience, but it can be a meaningful one. So, yeah, I agree. It's not necessarily about happiness, but I do think that there is a kind of set of conditions that most people can agree on as being part of the equation of the good life. And I think, again, those things, none of them necessarily require money to have. But when you're in a capitalist system, they do. They just do. And so, to have a certain amount of like freedom and autonomy and meaningful work and, those things. And of course, Aristotle also said, in addition to striving for excellence, he said that like you have to have the basic furniture of life needs to be kind of like food, housing, shelter, connection with other people, friendship, and the basic kind of goods and pleasures of life are also part of the good life. And he said that you can't have a flourishing life without them. And there are lots of people who are really struggling to just get the basics. And that's because we have decided that this is the world that we're going to live in.
So, as a philosopher, FF alumni, how would you advise people? You're a coach. How would you advise people how to feel lagom, a sense of deep satisfaction? How to like step off the hedonic treadmill, or would you say no, the hedonic treadmill is real and you just got to ride it?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of the idea of like, oh, you just need to step off the hedonic treadmill, because I don't know that we can. We can aim to, or we can try, but I'm not even sure that that is a goal per se. I think that we have to be gentle with ourselves and understand the context in which we live, and understand also just like how the human mind works. I mean, the hedonic treadmill is a thing because as humans, we can get used to lots of things, right? Like we can get used to the world getting better or getting worse. Like we always come back to equilibrium, right? And if there's a lot of, I just actually heard an interview with the woman who wrote Dopamine Nation. And she talks about like if you have a lot of like positive experiences, like you get big bursts of dopamine, then your brain always wants to come back to equilibrium. So it will kind of send, counter chemicals through your brain so that you kind of come back to stasis, and vice versa. And so I think that's just part of the human experience. It's sort of how we're built. And I don't know that we should sort of chastise ourselves for that. I think it's just sort of how we are. That said, I think that it is helpful to kind of question where you are headed. And I really do think the gratitude piece is like such an important part of it, because when you can really appreciate what you have, it's a way of like getting that kind of dopamine burst without having to do any extra work, honestly, because like we're always like, you got to work more, you got to get more, you got to have more money so that you can buy the next thing. It'll get you that little like squirt of dopamine, but you can also get the squirt of dopamine by like just noticing the pleasurable and wonderful things that are currently in your environment. And there are countless of them. I mean, for most of us, for anybody, like the temperature in this room is comfortable right now for me. That's a nice thing to have. I have this like mug that I am drinking a very nice like chai latte out of. That's a nice thing, right? Like there are lots and lots of beautiful things in my life, and I can experience the pleasure of them without having to really kind of trade anything for that pleasure except my attention. And it's simply about placing my attention in an intentional way so that I can live more deeply into my life as it is. And I think paradoxically, what that does is it gives us more energy and enthusiasm and vitality and desire to not necessarily do the work of getting the more stuff, but of bringing our gifts to the world and of getting access to some of those other things that make up the good life that maybe we feel like we are lacking, right? Connection, meaningful work, etc.
Yeah, your story, what you're talking about with the mug or the temperature, it reminds me of English mystic Evelyn Underhill, who said, "For want of attention, a thousand a thousand forms of loveliness escape us every day."
Yeah.
Right? Like it's really about attention more than anything else. No, I feel like financial freedom. I can't teach anyone to get rich, but I can teach people how to feel wealthy. And feeling wealthy is about like wanting what you already have. And, like we all have so much. Like we're like drenched. As like the Franciscans would say, we're drenched in grace.
Yeah.
Like yeah, there's just so many things just literally right in front of me that if I just paid attention to, I could take pleasure in without having desire.
And I think part of the structure of capitalism is that it is constantly pulling us away from that, right? It is constantly telling us to focus on what we don't have and what we still need. And I do think that like being grateful for what you have and like really reveling in your life as it is and in the things that being grateful for what you have it's a radical anti-capitalist act. It is a revolutionary orientation. And to me, that's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, capitalism is the ideology of more. And the problem with getting more is you're still stuck in the same boat. You still want more. And until you can actually move to a different ideology of enoughness, of lagom, you haven't really gone anywhere.
Yeah, I think there is a difference, though. Like, again, I don't think we need to give up wanting more altogether. I think we just have to be clear about what it's actually going to give us.
What is it going to give us?
Well, I don't think it's going to give us the thing that we think it's going to give us, right? Like, so I'm thinking about when I was at a meditation retreat, right? And talking about how, the ego is an illusion and all of these things. And we, right here and right now is all we have. And so sort of appreciating that. And I remember feeling just kind of despondent about this and being like, but what about all of my projects? Like, I have so many things I want to do. Is all of that meaningless? And I asked this question to the teacher, and his answer was like, oh, projects are great. Have your projects. To go do them. Like, dream, make, build. That's what humans do. We are creators. Like, that's not a bad thing. And I don't think it's a bad thing, again, to like strive for excellence, to strive for more. But just know that that is that's play. That is not where the source of your worthiness or your like wholeness or where you're going to find happiness or the good life or whatever. Like it is an expression of the good life. It is not the key to it.
Yeah, as someone once told me, what is true on the nirvanic level is not true on the samsaric level.
Right. It's like once you can say my life is deeply satisfying, then because I do think that human beings, like we are creative, we are striving beings. I just think it's part of what we do. But we can strive as a form of like expressing our human talents and sharing them with others and serving and our curiosities and all of those sorts of things, like our human, like feeling our expression in the world, but doing it from a place of satisfaction rather than a place of lack.
Yeah, it's interesting. Vicki Robin told me 2 weeks ago, like she hates this anti-ego talk, right? Like we are our egos on, in this material world, we experience life through ego, right? And to be an ego hater is to deny this life.
I think the same is true though of this kind of like desire for more. I actually think that like the desire for more is, yeah, it's part of our human essence. And so I'm reluctant to say that we should turn away from it or say that it's a bad thing. I think that it's not a bad thing. It's just not everything.
Well, as the Buddhists say, not too tight and not too loose about your desire. But what does this all mean for? And yeah, I mean, all the way back to personal finances. What does this all mean, right? Like because fundamentally, your money is either time or consumption. And so when you consume more, you get the bigger house or you go on the nicer vacation, what you're doing is you're actually taking away from your future self in some other manner.
Is that you think that's necessarily true?
Well, I mean, explain how it's not.
I don't know. I mean, I think that like we have that sort of thinking when I mean, it's for a lot of us that's how it works, right? Like you got to work to get the money and then you spend the money on the stuff and then you give up the time, right? Like that's how it goes. But there are plenty of people who have lots of money and who keep getting more money because it's like accumulating with compounding interest and they're not doing a damn thing about, to make it, right? So I don't know that like
Yeah, that's actually the point of financial freedom, right? Like once you get enough money, that money actually just creates more time/money for yourself.
right.
Well, to close, is there anything else that like you would want to tell people about lagom or your personal relationship with it?
Well, I don't know. I think this, I'm glad we had this conversation. I don't know that I've clarified anything for myself, but I feel like I'm still staring at the suitcase going like, I don't know. Do I get rid of stuff or do I get a bigger suitcase? Um, I, I do think that what this conversation has reminded me though, is how important gratitude is for all of it. And I think that that helps regardless of whether I end up getting rid of stuff or I end up getting a bigger suitcase, gratitude makes the path feel a lot easier um, and more joyful. And I think gives me a sense of that flourishing life and the components of the flourishing life that I already have and the sense of a good life that I already have. And if that's the goal for all of us, like, you know, it's a lot less work to just be grateful about what you have than to try and organize all of those external circumstances in just the right way.
Well, thank you, Danielle. We were just did lesson 2.6 on the concept of lagom and question what is enough. Danielle, as we close, tell people again what you do and how people can find you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a philosophical coach. You can find me at my website, daniellelasusa.com. And I do one-on-one coaching. You can apply for a free connection conversation with me there. Or, I can come speak at your organization about motherhood and philosophy and existentialism or anything like that. I'd love to hear from your listeners.
All right. Well, thank you, listeners. You have been listening to the School of Thank you for tuning in to the School of Financial Freedom podcast, where we ask, what does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit into that? We hope you enjoyed this episode and it helps you live with an increasing sense of empowerment, integrity, and agency in the world. For more information, resources, and to re-listen to this or any past episodes, visit our website at schoolofinancialfreedom.com. There you can find out when the next cohort of Financial Freedom 1, the online course is. If you've enjoyed today's show, please consider leaving us a review, as it helps more people find us and join our community of people interested in the intersection of money and personal and spiritual growth. I'm Doug LaSusa, founder of the School of Financial Freedom. You can also find me on Substack, where you can subscribe to my popular newsletter, Money and Meaning. I also love hearing from readers and listeners, so write me at www.douglasoy.com. I'm grateful that you listened, and I hope that this episode has given you hope and insight into taking control of your finances to live the life you want.